nature, and nature is giving her a sense of identity, and that is elevating her. It's elevating her by putting her in the glittering chair, which is the throne. The mass measured them out, picture by picture, so repetition of words, picture by picture, the outline of hero and beast. So it's an epic poem. She's the heroine, the idea of looking at other epic poems about hero and beast, and they're kind of in the stars. So in a sense, epic poetry is guiding the speaker of the poem as well as, the poet. Grew clearer and clearer. Their names were Greek, but a caravel. So questioning, and what is a caravel? The thing that I mentioned is not the thing that is in front of me. I puzzled. I found myself alone. Where had the crew gone? So she's alone. There is no crew, but nature is kind of giving her this identity, and so she's finding her sense of place by nature almost acting as a figure of its own, giving it to her. So that's the end of Helen in Egypt. Those were 3 poems by H.D., also known as Hilda Doolittle. Just some very basic things that I saw change-wise from, her first book, Sea Garden, to her last one, which was actually her hermeneutic definition, but Helen in Egypt being kind of a plug-in for her final poetry. So you move from very repetitious images to very sparse, driven images throughout the poem. There's less sexual innuendo in those last 2 poems as opposed to the first, which was just like rife with sexual, carnal energy. And she started out as kind of like a really sparse writing poet, but she got even more sparse in this last poem, and all throughout Helen in Egypt. She's been 10 poems talking about one idea. It's just very, very sparse, pared down, only the exact things we need on the page. The lines got even shorter. There were a couple of lines in 5 that were only 2 words, so not a lot of room for a person to work with. She never really experimented with punctuation or capitalization or moving things around in the poem. It's almost always kind of motivated by either Japanese poetry, so lots of haikus, or Greek epic poetry. And all of them play on these themes of like self-doubt, search for identity, religion, Greek literature, all kinds of mythology. So she didn't change a whole lot, but she did change a little. You can track that somewhat. So to close out this, I'm going to read out my letter to HD. So, Dear HD, aka Hilda Doolittle, like you, I go by the initials of my name, and I think this is what initially drew me to you. There's a certain amount of gender equivocation that happens when writing under such a pseudonym. Is she a boy? Is he a girl? And the fact that one person existed out there for whom this was not an issue, for which they deliberately played this, was enticing. And what I found upon perusing the chapters of several of your anthologies was even more interesting. I began with Sea Garden, your first standalone published work. Finally, those months spent in high school poring over the Odyssey, the Iliad, works by Herodotus, Aeschylus, whining to my teacher, what will I ever use this for in real life? All of that more than paid off in the first few pages of Sea Garden. I immediately recognized "Oh, be swift" as an invocation, so common in the pages of the Greek greats. This is a common phrase led me into unexpected territory. The third person, woven throughout this work, was jarring at first, a deceptive cover for the longing, unrequited, unsure eye speaker. But your message was made all the clearer by the repetition of images and words. And the images, let's talk about the images for a second. Such lovely, natural, inspired images, beautiful aquatic and botanical images, as one would expect from a book entitled Sea Garden. Simple things like oak trees and root systems and brambles seem to take on a life of their own in your stanzas, and the undercurrent of desire, especially sexual desire, vivifies these images. One of my favorite lines, taken from The Helmsman, I think captures some of the wild, untamed allure of this book. We wandered from pine hills, through oak and scrub oak tangles. We broke hyssop and bramble. We caught flow and new bramble fruit in our hair. We laughed as each branch whipped back. We tore our feet in half-buried rocks and knotted roots and acorn cups. It has somewhat bewildered me in subsequent readings of this poem how a rather painful memory, that of tearing your feet in the rocks and tide, can do so many things at once in this poem. It is evocative of the pain of desire, demonstrates the relationship shared by the speaker and the lover, and is quite beautiful, to say the least. How can you make something quite painful seem so austere and alluring? And reminded me so much of Japanese poems that I've read. Something McKay said in your Cambridge Companion told me was intentional, was in fact a hallmark of the Imagist movement that you helped create. I next picked up Red Roses for Bronze, a volume I simply chose for the odd title and all the questions it sparked. How many ways can one interpret Red Roses for Bronze, you ask? Hundreds, even thousands. I tried not to let myself settle too heavily on one interpretation, lest it change my reading. I did notice a distinct change between this book and Steegarden, though. The speaker comes across as more confident, more self-assured, but there's still the same wandering, questioning quality that the speaker employs to their surroundings. I would like to say that this is the result of personal growth, but I cannot be sure. That same undercurrent of sexual desire, with nearly every image being an oblique metaphor for carnal desire, or just this me projecting, existed throughout this work. 15 years you sustained this passion. Upon turning to the next book, I wondered if you could keep it up for 15 more. The Walls Do Not Fall, as well as the rest of the books from your trilogy, showed a marked change. McKay marks the culprit as being sessions with Sigmund Freud in the onset of World War II, but I am sure you can shed better light on this. These seem as valid culprits of any I know, although I always wonder how any event or person can affect the life of another. This is something I would greatly appreciate your opinion on. Anyway, the titular poem of this anthology did place me firmly in your present, with guns and ruins and all the stark realities of living on the outside of war. This reality seemed to remind you of another place of wartime, that of the ancient Greeks. Having studied a great deal of classic literature myself, I am surprised by your impulse. It never occurred to me to compare the Afghanistan War or the current war on ISIS to, say, the Trojan War. Modern-day soldiers do not remind me of hoplites, and I wonder why this is. Helen in Egypt was my favorite selection of your poems. The same battles and bruises, the glint of armor, the ships sailing across the sea, the romance, the mystery, was all there as in a modern-day epic. And it was from a woman's mouth, a timbre I was unfamiliar with in epic poetry. How strange it was at first, and yet how exciting. I never heard of this alternate telling of Helen of Troy's fate, how she had been sent by Zeus to Egypt as a punishment for loving a man other than her husband. It was an intriguing turn of events, all the better vivified in your austere and beautiful poetry. You returned to the epic format for this one, but you kept the shortened lines and sparse wordage from the trilogy, from the Imagist movement. Each poem is a series of driven, connected, intense images. I'm so glad that you chose in many ways to share the gift you had for images with the world. I only hope that by reading your work, my own poems will be affected. And thanks for writing an epic poem from a girl's perspective. If there's one thing I can take away from this, it's that the world needs a few more ladies in kick-ass boots to fight their own battles. So that was my presentation on HD. I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope you give HD's poetry a chance. He does have some interesting things to offer. Thanks very much. Have a nice day.